Sunset was the best time to explore, even with the temperature drop. Work was done for the day, and there was just enough time to get away and be on your own for a little bit before the call for dinner went out. Crawling over the crumbling gray stones, Piper was looking for something in particular. Climbing through what she was told was once a tall building, the floors were at an angle just awkward enough to make hurting yourself an inevitability over a long enough time frame, especially with the rusting metal that seemed to jut out at every angle. Still, Piper pushed deeper into the cavern. Eventually, she was far enough inside that she needed to turn on her lantern. Now bathed in a yellow artificial light, the young explorer climbed over a pile of what looked like furniture, but had been warped and rusted into a tangle by whatever calamity that had brought the building down so long ago. Finally, the yellow light hit Piper's goal. Her big eyes opened wider, pupils dilating in the darkness to take in the glorious view in front of her. Piper slid her hands into the straps of her scuffed and worn overalls and slumped down onto a cross-legged sit on the floor. Her eyes moved across the mural, painted on the wall as if it were a living story rather than just faded propaganda. One of the armored figures in the picture looked as tall as a mountain, and it had blue lights coming from clawed hands. It was like nothing Piper had ever seen before, and that's why she kept returning to the spot. Her imagination ran wild, thinking about what these things were and why the mural was created. It was a place that few knew about in the community, and she preferred it that way. The other giant always bothered her. The way it was painted, it gave Piper an unpleasant feeling, like something bad was about to happen. It was taller than the other giant and carried a large weapon in its right arm, while the other had a humanoid hand. The entire thing looked like it was about to leap toward its prey at any moment. Lost in her thoughts and imagination, time passed quickly. Her wandering mind was eventually interrupted by a loud, familiar voice which echoed down the crumbled pathway in the building. In a voice of exasperation, it cried, "Piper! Come out here! It's past night time!" Piper recognized the voice instantly and sighed in frustration. Though this room had windows, they were blocked by fallen debris, and it was easy to lose track of time. By the time the girl had gathered herself and prepared to stand, her older brother crawled into the room. Standing up straight in the space, he stretched his back and asked, "Why do you always come here? Are you causing trouble?" "I didn't cause any trouble. I was looking at the giants," Piper argued in her defense. Milo scoffed and replied, "They're not giants, dummy. They're machines." Piper scowled at being called the name, but instead of calling him a name in return, she simply stuck her tongue out at him before settling back down and turning again toward the mural. Milo sighed and looked on as well at the two machines who were locked in a pose promising imminent violence. "I like the one with the claws. It looks like a creature," Piper said, just loud enough for her brother to hear. He sighed and took in the mural, as if in deep thought. "I like the other one. It looks like a person in armor, and that big gun on the arm looks powerful," Milo stated with authority. Piper looked up at her brother, rolled her eyes, and returned her gaze to the scene before asking, "What do you think they were? Do you think they were real?" Milo glanced back toward the crawl space that led into the room, and he realized he would need to humor his little sister for at least a few more minutes, though it would surely result in being chewed out by an elder upon their return to the camp. He looked over the painted giants. The one with the claws was painted a faded olive green, while the other was a matted light blue and gray camo which matched the snow-blown scene of the painting. "I think they are real. Or were real. It could explain why the city looks like it does now, more rubble than buildings. Maybe the artist was making sure people remembered these machines and what happened from an earlier fight, before the one that caused all this," Milo said as he looked down to nudge a piece of broken concrete with his foot. "Do you think they'll come back?" Piper asked with no small measure of concern. Milo shook his head and replied, "I don't know why they would. There's nothing left to break or to fight for over here." Piper scrunched up her face as if sorting out a tough problem in her head before stating, "I think the clawed one was the hero. It was here to save our planet from the other one." Milo frowned and responded, "If so, it must have lost. This place wouldn't look like this, and we wouldn't be here." His sister gazed up at him briefly before pointing out, "Well, someone painted this, and it was before the building fell down, or why bother? So maybe it did okay until later?" If there was one thing Milo hated more than when Piper was being a brat, it was when she had a good point. Naturally, he kept quiet and didn't concede anything. Piper stood up, drawn to the painting on the wall. She traced her fingers over the irregular silver star of her favorite monster's leg. She looked back at her brother and retorted, "They could come back for us." Successfully fighting off his brotherly urge to put Piper in her place for saying such a silly thing, Milo just sighed and said, "Yeah, maybe someday." After nearly a minute of watching her trace her fingers over the painting's details, he added, "We should head back. The elders will be mad at us for missing mealtime again." "Okay," Piper responded, and the two of them began their crawl back out of the rubble. As they moved, the mural and its depiction of impending violence was overcome with darkness. 2 kilometers outside Cooper, Cascadia, Rocky, 27 January 2775, 0634 local time. Sitting against the left foot of our CRB-27 Crab, Captain Brooklyn Forsetti shrugged off the chilling wind and tried to count the days since her last cup of coffee. Hell, she would even settle for some of that tea grown down on the southern coast. Anything with some caffeine would help after spending the last week on the run from those Rimworlder knuckleheads. The temporary warmth of the drink would help battle the bitterly cold air. The weather had turned ugly over the last few days, with looming dark gray clouds that only seemed to get darker and never let enough sunlight through to warm the planet. She lifted her eyes from the ground, where she was trying to get both to focus at the same time, and saw one of the comtechs marching in her direction. The sour look on his face suggested they would have to be on the move again. Sure enough, the data on the slate he passed her proved that they had just a few minutes before the forest they were sitting in would be crawling with Amaris's flunkies. Brooklyn chewed on her lower lip in frustration for a moment before ordering the withdrawal and retreat deeper into the continent's interior. The plan, if it could really be called one, was to avoid direct conflict with a superior attacking foe in hope of buying time for some more SLDF to show up. Unfortunately, if Amaris was liquidating Star League assets on Rocky, he was likely doing it across the hegemony systems, or at least enough of them that help was likely not coming. Even so, as the leader of what was left of the SLDF garrison on the planet, the captain had to operate as if help would descend from the skies at any moment. The cockpit of her Crab was always a little warm. Brooklyn suspected a faulty heatsink, even though the tech swore up and down that everything was green. She shook her head as she slid out of her jumpsuit and into the standard SLDF coolant vest and narrow helmet. 5 minutes later, she was stomping her 50-ton battle mech through the forest, scanning for any Rimworlder forces that might have leapfrogged their positions. Behind her mech stomped a couple of Mercuries, 3 Stingers, and 1 Shadowhawk, which was dragging its right leg in an awkward gait thanks to a PPC shot which tapped its knee actuator on the way out of the city. Cooper was crawling with Amaris's troops, and from the calm chatter they weren't setting up shop to be good stewards of land and people. Massacres and destruction of industrial and cultural sites were widespread, and it boiled Brooklyn's blood to hear that the museums of the city burned along with so many other structures. "Any scanner contacts back there?" Brooklyn asked into the unit's secured comm link. A few moments later, the response came from the Mechwarrior, a Lieutenant Ricker, if she recalled the name correctly. He said, "There were some fuzzy contacts at extreme range, but they look like VTOLs by their speed and movement pattern. They're likely sweeping for us at the campsite." "At least our intel is still good," Brooklyn muttered to herself before saying, "Let me know if they head in our direction." 10 minutes of slow marching deeper into the forest and gaining altitude was just moments of flight for the Rimworld VTOLs, who swept their way across the trees looking for remnants of the SLDF garrison. Spotting the infrared signature of several vehicles, the lead VTOL's pilot sent the coordinates back to the spaceport and was about to fall back with his wingman when the helicopter's view screen instantly darkened to compensate for the light of a laser. The blue beam flashed across the wingman's VTOL's center of mass, cutting through the light helicopter as if it were made of paper. Its burning wreckage fell unceremoniously into the forest below. The lead VTOL banked hard, seeking to put distance between itself and the force it was chasing, but just as it brought its direction back to due north, autocannon rounds sprayed past the pilot on the right. Reacting on pure instinct, the pilot banked to the left, away from the autocannon rounds, which took it right into the combined set of 3 beams of emerald laser light. The Stingers had circled back and set up a shot, and the VTOL had flown right into it with the aid of the Shadowhawk. The cheers over the comlink were short-lived as seconds later the first of the artillery rounds exploded among the SLDF Garrison forces. Brooklyn pounded her fist against the console as one of the Stingers was hit in the shoulder by a high-explosive munition which ripped the battlemech in half like it was made of paper. The Star League vehicles attempted to scatter and move away from the incoming fire, but there was nowhere to go. At every turn and direction, the falling artillery spread destruction. Brooklyn growled into the mic of her neurohelmet. "Fall back! Damn it, get out of there!" But instead of a chorus of affirmatives, there were only cries and the crackle of severed comlink connections. Backing up from the fray, Brooklyn shook her head at the folly of this. Stopping to take out the VTOLs had left them immobile for too long, but ignoring them would have brought on a similar outcome. Finally, after taking a frustrated breath, Brooklyn turned her crab toward the ridge ahead and began to march. Those who had escaped the artillery barrage could meet her at the next waypoint. "Rally forward if you can, Kerensky, help us," Brooklyn spoke into the comlink, hoping at least a few of her comrades had made it through. 12 hours later, those scattered infantry and few vehicles which survived the barrage huddled in the dark. Without a fire to keep warm, everyone was chilled to the bone. Rocky was always cold, but the last few days had been bitterly chilly thanks to that dense, dark gray cloud cover which just refused to go away. Brooklyn could find warmth in the cockpit of her mech, but it felt wrong to sit up there while the others suffered. Ultimately, she had to make the call. If General Kerensky was giving out medals for shortest insurgencies, she would surely be in the running. With an aching heart, she called the survivors together and gave them their last order. "I know this is going to be rough to hear, but we have neither the resources nor threat potential to resist the Rimworlders. I want you to leave your weapons and head back to Cooper. When you reach the city, disperse and blend in with the citizenry. There may be a time when the balance of power shifts, but right now there's no value in pointless sacrifice," Brooklyn said, struggling to keep eye contact with the shivering soldiers. One of them, a private she couldn't name at the moment thanks to the smeared dirt and burns on his face, raised his hand briefly and then dropped it before asking, "What about you? The mech?" Brooklyn glanced back toward the mountains and said, "I'll take it up into the wilds and ditch it before making my way back to Cooper." That seemed to be enough to end the debate. Everyone knew this was over, and now it was going to be a matter of individual survival. Maybe a few of them could last long enough to get the story out and back to Terra. Cooper, Cascadia, Rocky, 2nd February, 2775, 0218, local time. Digging her fingernails into the sides of her command chair, Brooklyn tried to contain her rage at the video feed on her heads-up display. Tapping into the city's security camera footage allowed her to keep tabs on the comings and goings of Amaris's troops, although what she was seeing now wasn't the behavior of soldiers in the field. It looked more like piracy. Clearly, there was no line the Rimworlders wouldn't cross. Brooklyn replayed the video, taking in the sight of the soldiers looting artifacts from the city's museum before it was burned. Each time she rewatched it, the fire deep inside her grew in intensity. She couldn't quite explain it, but invading and occupying a planet for personal gain, or whatever messed up rationale Amaris had for starting all this, didn't quite seem as petty and small as theft of historical artifacts. Lying to her soldiers was rough, but when Brooklyn approached the ravine where she planned on ditching the crab, she just couldn't force herself to do it. She had grown to love this old machine, and the thought of it rusting at the bottom of a pit without one last good fight seemed a travesty. Much like those artifacts, the mech deserved better, so she turned and spent the next few nights creeping as close as she could to Cooper. This was no small feat, as it was difficult to conceal a 50-ton battlemech, but every meter closer to the city was one less meter that she would have to dash when the time came. If Amaris expected to loot this world, he would have to pay for it. It was early, with several more hours before the star would crest the horizon, and it looked like they were bugging out. Several dropships at the starport were being loaded with troops as well as loot. Brooklyn counted her breaths, knowing that she had to time this right. If she acted too soon, her single battlemech would be overwhelmed. If she waited too long, then the Rimworlders would make their escape without any payback. Her crab was hunched down behind some abandoned light industrial buildings on the edge of town. The fusion engine was warm and roaring since Brooklyn figured they would be too busy loading up to be concerned about straggler SLDF forces. They had already won. It was over. Why worry? As the last few visible battlemechs marched up into the dropships, Brooklyn made her move. The crab lurched forward, nearly falling from her eagerness to get into the fight. Throttled forward, Brooklyn's Nero helmet aided the mech's gyro in keeping it upright as she ran at full speed toward the spaceport. Buildings flashed by, every heavy step waking up those in the neighborhood. Refugees stuffed into dark corners of old buildings were woken up by the thud, thud, thud of a battlemech's run across ferrocrete. The precious seconds ticked by, and Brooklyn knew that every one of them that passed meant more of the enemy could prepare for her arrival. The rational portion of her brain was screaming at her that this was stupid and she would do nothing to impact these massive dropships. But she had to try. She couldn't dismiss those concerns with anything but anger. She wouldn't freeze to death on this planet without taking a few of these thugs with her. Reaching the outer fencing of the spaceport, Brooklyn didn't slow down. The remaining Ameris soldiers manning the gate waved their arms, and some fired on the mech with their rifles, but it did nothing but chip the paint on the crab. She blew through the fencing and only slowed to make a turn toward the main spaceport landing pads. Vehicles were scattered everywhere, inside and between the hangars, and for now her presence was triggering more shock than determined resistance. Brooklyn targeted the nearest vehicles and fired her medium lasers. Each of the emerald beams sliced through the unarmored trucks and sent up plumes of exploding fuel. Each shot from her lasers felt like divine retribution against these bastards who had hunted down her garrison. Brooklyn glared into the view screen, picked out her next target, and fired the mech's large laser, which bisected an aerospace fighter in the process of taxiing out on a runway. Each successful shot was vindication, and though return fire was increasing, it appeared that she had timed her attack well. One of the dropships was dropping lines and preparing for an emergency liftoff, while the other slowly opened its cargo bay door. Brooklyn's glee had her balancing on the edge of control. She kept the crab moving, dodging the occasional SRM and burst of machine gun fire, but kept stalking forward, looking for a path to create more carnage among the forces of Ameris. What she missed in her rage was the predator in her midst. Waiting until the time was right, just as the crab passed a burning warehouse, a Phoenix Hawk struck. Hitting the crab at full sprint and firing its jump jets at the last moment, the 45-ton machine crashed into its 50-ton foe. Brooklyn struggled with the controls of her mech, but mostly just to hang on as her whole world turned sideways. The restraining straps kept her in the command seat, but only just barely. There were shorting systems, error messages all over the HUD, and an annoying electronic voice that kept blurting out, "Return to center to establish equilibrium." "No shit," she grunted as she tried to push up from where the mech had crashed into a hangar. Broken concrete and metal sheathing fell from the crab as the mech slowly rose to its feet. For the briefest moment, the light captured both battlemechs on the verge of unleashing their wrath on each other. Brooklyn bit her lower lip, fiercely leaning the crab forward, both arms extended. The Phoenix Hawk loomed higher, with its right arm-mounted laser pointed toward the SLDF crab. Firing at nearly the same moment, both battlemechs unleashed their weapons on each other, and anyone watching that massive machines clash had to turn away. Lasers cut into armor, shearing away defenses and cutting deep. In the distance, the first dropship lifted off, sending plumes of plasma and smoke across the starport, while the other's cargo door slowly rolled to a stop. Shadows moved inside moments later. As unusual as it was on this cold planet, the crab's cockpit was stifling. As Brooklyn stalked the Phoenix Hawk, trying to keep it in her sights, she cycled her lasers as quickly as she could. System warnings were plentiful, and that damned heatsink she was worried about had cut out after less than a minute of sustained fire. Though through it, she just kept firing. Every shot, every hit, every ton of armor she could shave from this RimWorld's Phoenix Hawk would delay them and cost them just a little bit more. The Phoenix Hawk shrugged off most of the incoming damage, but when the large laser scanned across the mech's upper chest and cockpit, its Mechwarrior panicked and hit the jump jets. Rising on plumes of plasmic fire, it sought to leap over the crab and force it to turn. Brooklyn raised her mech's arms as quickly as she could, one of them now damaged and slower than the other. She let loose with another barrage of lasers, even though her HUD was warning of imminent shutdown. The lasers cut into the Phoenix Hawk's relatively untouched legs as it sailed over the crab. Brooklyn screamed with rage as she turned her mech to try to follow its trajectory, just as the first of the long-distance shots began to fly past her mech from the direction of the remaining dropship. Every second that passed was borrowed from her anger, Firing again and again at the Phoenix Hawk, Brooklyn ignored her heat. The mech shuddered from the impact of something hard, the right leg buckling. Brooklyn struggled to keep the mech upright, but it stumbled. Long-range missiles peppered the crab. Then a hit from a particle projection cannon cut deeply into the right torso, the already damaged right arm going limp. Seconds. That's how long Brooklyn measured her life as she took aim one last time with the crab's left arm. She squeezed the trigger just as an impact shook her mech and completely knocked it to the ground. The last desperate medium laser shot hit true, bathing the Shadowhawk's already damaged cockpit in light, melting through the cracked plating and structure and boiling away what was inside. As if it were a marionette with its strings cut, the Phoenix Hawk crumbled to the broken-up Ferrocrete. Seeing it fall made Brooklyn cry out in anguished glee just before the whole cockpit went dark. Cooper, Cascadia, Rocky, 2nd February, 2775, 1433 local time. Light spilling in through the cracked seal woke Brooklyn. She coughed as dirt and dust cascaded into the cockpit and filled the air with particulate debris. Lifting her head was a challenge as the neurohelmet on her head felt heavier than usual. In fact, everything felt heavier than usual. She lifted her hand to tug at the helmet, but felt nothing. Squinting through the dim light, she could see her right hand was wedged tightly between the command chair and the crumpled side of her cockpit, now a meter closer than it normally would be. There was more success with her left hand, which once it was unbuckled, fell from her head and crashed to the broken and burnt-out console in front of her. Brooklyn was hanging from her support straps, helpless. There were voices outside. Some asked if she was alive, shouting the words from an unseen vantage point. Not knowing if responding would result in help or a live grenade, Brooklyn gave up and croaked out a weak, "I'm here." Thankfully, the reply didn't arrive in the form of high explosive. A few minutes of prying and bending of steel hinges basked the Mechwarrior in harsh orange of work lights. With the help of several starport employees, Brooklyn was dragged from her ruined battlemech. There, standing on top of her former machine, she held her wounded arm tightly to her chest and gazed out at the destruction before her. Half the city was ablaze, but the most notable sensation she felt was the bitter cold. Wearing just her coolant vest and shorts, Brooklyn crossed her arms over her body and shivered. The sky was dark and boiled with black clouds that blotted out the afternoon sun. They looked so unnatural and foreboding, and when the flakes of what looked like snow fell on her skin, they didn't melt, but smeared away into gray ash. Sitting down, Brooklyn took in her surroundings, and for the first time since the arrival of Amerisa's forces, she felt not anger, but righteous indignation. She had made them pay. Thanks so much for giving this little piece of independent fiction a go. I hope you enjoyed it. The art piece for this story was commissioned from the very talented Bruce Patnaud, who did a wonderful job of bringing the scene to life. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button to increase the likelihood that you'll see my nonsense in the future. Take care this week, and please go out and make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.